I am an Anglican pastor in Melbourne. I've been in pastoral ministry for about 11 years now. Before that, I was an academic. I did a PhD on the language of the people of Aceh in Indonesia, and finished that in the end of 1983. That was at the Australian National University, and I spent a lot of time in fieldwork, living in the village and eating a lot of rice and fish and talking about faith and many other things with the people in Aceh. And I had a wonderful time. People were very welcoming to me while I was there. And I learnt a lot about Islam, as you might learn about Christianity, by hanging around Christians and talking to them and understanding how they think. I lived with an older lady and some of her children and her sister. She'd been to Mecca and often spoke about that, so we would have conversations about those sorts of things. I was aware at the time that it was not necessarily easy to be a Christian in Aceh. Churches would be burnt from time to time, and in a nearby major town, the only place where the Christians could get permission to build a church was over the water. And there had been a number of times in the past where people had even been killed for their faith there. So I was aware of that, but my own personal experience was one of great welcome and made many close friends. I did sort of sense at the time that if I engaged with Islam systematically, that would fundamentally change, or it could change, my interactions. I was very much there, although a committed Christian, I was there to study the language, and I was a guest on that basis. So that was the parameter of my interactions there. And I kept going back doing research throughout the 80s. Aceh was very interesting because the Dutch had fought a long and bloody insurgency for about 40 years in the province of Aceh, and trying to pacify it, as they might say, that is to put down the insurgency. And this very famous case, the Achenese War, and after doing my PhD, I went to Holland and spent a year studying the Dutch manuscripts and talking to some of the civil servants who were still alive, who'd been Aceh specialists. I met 3 of them who'd worked on Achenese topics before the Second World War. And there was a great scholar called Christian Snoeckegronje who had lived in Mecca incognito as a Muslim, actually, in the 1880s, and then he was invited by the Dutch authorities to analyse why they were not winning the war. Unlike other areas, they'd gone in with their guns and captured the capital, and then they found they'd won the country. But in Aceh, that just didn't happen. There was this constant battle going on, and he did a profound analysis of their culture and language and wrote a military report that was actually a very detailed ethnography and discussion of the language, the linguistics. He was the father of Achenese linguistics, which was my area, and also explained to the Dutch authorities that they were fighting an Islamic Jihad insurgency, and developed a military strategy for the Dutch authorities that enabled them to, in a sense, win the peace. Although isolated attacks against Dutch people continued right up until the Japanese arrived in 1939. The Dutch used to call that Achenese murder, but the incidences decreased steadily year after year until there were just a few each year by the time the Japanese came. And I was aware of the psychiatric reports that had been done by the Dutch at that time on those young men. I'd read accounts written by an Achenese man on seeing a man go off and engage in one of those attacks. I'd studied it from both sides, read the Dutch sources and also the Achenese poetry and songs and stories. So the Achenese were very proud of their history of jihad, I must say, and you couldn't be in Aceh and not know about that aspect of their history. So that was one area of Islamic theology I had a fairly good understanding of. That is the theology of warfare. Actually, it had gone back a long way. The Achenese had fought jihads against the Portuguese and against many of their neighbours, and much of this was written in their history, their epic poetry, so I was exposed to that. When I was in Holland, I worked on translating from Dutch into English and editing a catalogue of Achenese manuscripts by one of the great Arabic and Indonesian scholars in Holland, and many of the texts were about warfare as well. So I had been exposed to that aspect, but I must say that when I left academia, I didn't anticipate that Islam would be the sort of focus of attention that it's been in recent years. After I did my PhD, I spent a year in Holland studying Arabic, from one of those old scholars, and also translating the catalogue of manuscripts and doing other work. And then I had a year at MIT as a visiting researcher, and then spent a year at UCLA and Stanford and UC Santa Cruz also doing research before going to Melbourne University, where I had the privilege of rebuilding the linguistics department and became head of that department, and continued going back to Aceh until the early 90s. And then I felt God calling me into pastoral ministry. So over 6 years I studied part-time and then full-time and became a cleric. And I must admit, for a couple of decades I was an Aceh specialist, but no one in the world knew, you heard of Aceh except all the people in Holland that I met as part of their colonial history. There's statues of generals from Aceh scattered throughout Holland, and I think I even visited a friend who lived in Aceh Street in Leiden. But most of the world had not heard of it, but when the tsunami struck they did, and I found that very sad, because I'd done a lot of dialect surveys, and quite a number of the dialects that I'd visited and documented were covered in 80 feet of water, so they were completely wiped out along the west coast. And in fact, as soon as I heard the first reports, I knew that 100,000 or more people had died because of just where everyone lives in Aceh and where the villages are, and the nature of their vulnerability. But 9/11 did, I must admit, wake me up to something. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, I got a phone call from a friend saying, "Mark, you've got to wake up and watch the television," which I did. And in the bright New York sunshine, I saw those events happening. And I did realise from my history of studying Aceh that there was an ideology or a force that could produce such an event. And it did not surprise me when in the backpacks of some of those Saudi young men who did those atrocities, verses of the scripture were found and quoted that were exactly the same verses that the Acehnese had used 100 years ago in their insurgency against the Dutch. And their fervour and their motivation was of no surprise to me. But what did surprise me and challenge me was the awareness that there was a worldwide movement, which Muslims generally called, up until that time, the Islamic movement, which was an awakening, an Islamic awakening that's been going on for about 70 years, a revival, a reformation really, a desire to re-establish Islam after all the many defeats that the world of Islam experienced in the 19th and early 20th century. After 9/11, I devoted myself to studying the sources of Islam. Imagine if someone had spent years relating to Christians and so had a fair idea of what Christians were like, but had never read the Bible, and then sat down and read the Bible for themselves and actually encountered Christ, you know. So I read the sources. I'm going to speak about those sources in a minute. There are fundamental texts on which Islam is based, and spent a summer reading about Muhammad, many volumes. There's a lot of material that establishes the canon of Muhammad's life. And I must admit that was a profoundly disturbing experience for me, for reasons which I'll explain a bit later. And I felt quite saddened, really, deeply distressed, because although there's a lot of things in Muhammad's life that are very concerning, what is particularly concerning is that in Islamic theology he is regarded as the best example for all to follow. And a sort of a sickness of my soul came upon me, you know, what can be done about this? How can we respond to this? And out of that time, I'd always been aware of the situation of Christians living under Islam. It was an issue I could see in Aceh and had encountered others before from other countries who'd had some difficulties. So that became a great interest of mine. What does Islam teach about living in an Islamic society when you're not a Muslim, and what does that look like? So I began to write and to teach. I want to also say, and I'll come back to this a number of different times, one of the effects for me of studying Islam personally, and my background is as a researcher, I just do not believe someone if they gives me a second or a third-hand account of a matter. You know, you can buy biographies of Muhammad written by people who've read second and third-hand accounts themselves, but I'm interested in the actual sources. You know, if I want to know who Jesus was, I really need to read the Gospels. I mean, you could read lots of people who've written about the life of Christ, or see a film, or you know, watch Charlton Heston, you know. but if you really want to know about Jesus, you should read the Gospels, because that is the source that everything else is based on. So I had to do that for myself. I'm an incredibly sceptical person about accuracy of information, and So that engagement was fundamental to me. But one of the effects of that, how difficult that's been, is been to fall in love with Christ more, because his example and his life is absolutely compelling and transforming. And sometimes you have to see a different alternative and understand its implications to fully grasp that fact. If you've grown up in a Christian environment and gone to a Christian school and a Christian college and a Christian church and all your friends are Christian, you might not realise that if people don't follow Christ, their world can be constructed on completely different principles. And that the life that you enjoy is actually not simply based on common human values, but is actually deeply grounded on Christ himself. And getting that clear is a really helpful thing and one of the good fruits of studying Islam. Now, the philosopher Wittgenstein said that sometimes we think that we're tracing the shape of reality, but in fact all we're doing is tracing the frame through which we're looking. And that can be a mistake with Islam, that you think you're describing what is a mosque or what is a religion or what is Islam or what is the Quran, but all you're doing is just tracing your knowledge of the Bible or the church or Jesus or something else. So people write biographies of Muhammad that are just like, this is the Islamic Christ, you know. Or a good example, there was a sermon given on 9/11, this last 9/11 in New York by a leading rabbi, Reformed rabbi, who described mosques as places of study, prayer and quiet reflection. And I thought, that's a perfect description of a synagogue. But actually mosques have they have other functions as well. And so he's approached the subject of Islam and taken his vast knowledge of his own faith and just said, it'll just be like my own faith. And that's not very helpful. It's not a good assumption. I must admit my background in fieldwork, in anthropological linguistic fieldwork, had trained me not to make those assumptions. You can't go into another language and another culture and just assume everything is familiar. You have to assume the opposite, that you don't know anything, and that everything has to be observed carefully, and you have to build a new worldview for a different context. So that's what I'm going to share some of my thoughts about that here today. I have put all the handouts that'll be on the PowerPoint there for you, so just to reduce the note-taking. I must confess there'll be a lot of information in my presentations, and I hope not too much, but the handouts are there to minimise your effort in making notes and give you an opportunity to process. And please ask questions. I love questions. No question is too hostile or too off the wall, so I look forward to that. I want to also say that I won't be speaking today so much about Muslims. I will be from time to time. I'll be speaking about Islam. How does it work as a system? What did Muhammad do? How do Muslims respond to this information? So, but I'm not going to give you a lecture on the diversity of Muslims in the world. There's a huge diversity of Muslims in the world. They believe and follow many different principles. There's lots of variety. It's really wrong to stereotype people, and particularly Muslims, especially in an environment where there's tensions and conflict in the world today. And I'm going to explain as clearly as possible how I think Islam works, and I'll be taking you to sources, Islamic sources all the time, that I've checked carefully. But I don't want you to think that just because I've said this is what the Quran teaches, that every Muslim you meet will think that, or even know that, or work that way. It's not that different with Christianity, although it is somewhat different. That is, you know, it's very clear that the official Christian teaching is that Jesus will come again. You know, it's in the creeds and the confessions of faith. But many Christians live as if that was a completely irrelevant aspect of their faith. It's not a practical thing for them. And so you need to be aware that there's a gap sometimes between what the faith teaches and what an individual person lives. Another thing also to be aware of is that the influence of the fundamental teachings of a religion exert their power over individuals and over societies gradually and over long periods of time. I sometimes think it's like a ship with a compass. The ship is on the ocean, and every now and again someone says, oh, let's look at the map. So they go into the room and they pull out the map and they work out the compass and they say, oh, we should be going that way. So off they go for a while, and then, you know, a little bit later they forget and they go somewhere else, and they check up and they go somewhere else. And so a faith is a kind of compass that keeps correcting people into a certain direction. It doesn't mean that every captain or every pilot's always completely on track. They aren't. But there is there is a kind of core to the faith, to the scriptures of Islam, that's serious and indisputable, And just because you're a Muslim, you don't follow everything, but that is what's there, and that does shape the way the religion and the culture works over long periods of time. So that's what I'm going to be speaking about. Now, Islam. Islam is an Arabic word which means submission. And Muslim means a submitter. Arabic's based on three consonants, triconsonantal roots. So SLM is the root. Islam is the person, and Islam is the path, and Muslim is the person. So you can see the SLM in both of these is they're kind of related words to each other. And the meaning of being a submitter is summed up in the word Abdullah, which means a slave of Allah. Slave of Allah. And Islam basically calls people to submit to God by being his slave. And the slave-master relationship is a very important metaphor in Islam. Now, the best way for me to get into this subject is to bring up what is the human problem. If you were to ask a Christian audience anywhere in the world, what is the fundamental human problem, what would the answer be? Yeah, and I've asked people that question in many countries, and they always give me the same answer. In Islam, that's not the fundamental problem. In Islam, the fundamental problem with humanity is ignorance. Imagine that you're a slave in the house and you don't know what your job is, what your job description is. And you're in a risky situation because you are a slave and you should be doing something, but no one's told you. And the best thing you can do is find out whether you're meant to be digging the garden or cleaning the dishes or whatever it is. You need guidance. So ignorance is the problem, the solution is guidance, and the result is success in this world and the next. Falah. And it's interesting, the Quran divides people into winners and losers. There's a lot of mention of losers in the Quran. These are the unsuccessful ones. Even the story of Adam and Eve in the Quran is retold, but it's interpreted as a story of guidance and misguidance. So the emphasis is on Satan misleading Adam, that Adam and Eve take Satan as their guide instead of following the guidance of Allah. And it's rephrased in a different way. Whereas the first chapters of Genesis are a study in the inevitability of human sin. The story of the fall in the Quran is a study in what happens when you follow the wrong guide and you're misguided. So it's a different framework. The call to prayer every day in Islam says, come to success, come to success. Someone showed me a brochure they got from a mosque in Turkey they were visiting, and the tour guide was a sort of an evangelist. Well, good on them for having a go at trying to convert people, I guess, to their faith. But in the translation, it translates this prayer as come to salvation, come to salvation. I looked at it, I thought, that's not what it says. That's what the Christian equivalent is. It says come to success in Arabic. And what they're trying to do there is use a word that we resonate with and feel positively about in order to communicate it. So this is the problem of mistaking the frame for the reality. So the reality is a call to success. Whereas in the biblical Christian reading of the Bible, the problem is sin, the solution is forgiveness, the result is rescue, or technical term salvation, and more of a division into what's lost and what's found, what's been redeemed and what hasn't, rather than winners and losers. If you keep this idea in your mind of ignorance leads to guidance, leads to success, a lot of things about Islam will fall into place. Like if you go to a mosque and get brochures, they'll speak a lot about guidance and the need for guidance and being rightly guided. It's a big theme in Islam. Even the word Sharia means a path, the right path that you're guided along, that you walk along the guided path. Now, how do you become a Muslim? If you say, well, I'd like to be Allah's servant, if he's the master, that's obviously my destiny. How would you do that? Well, you say and believe this Islamic creed, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is Allah's messenger. And if you understand this and you grasp it and you fully believe it, then you are a Muslim. That's how you become a Muslim, by reciting that. And remember, Islam is about guidance, and what guidance is contained in this statement. It's contained in Muhammad is Allah's messenger. That's what the guidance is that enables you to escape from ignorance. And so then if you've signed up on that and you agree that Muhammad's your guide, the next question is, how can I be guided? Where can I find out about Muhammad if he's the guide, if he's brought the guidance? And there's two ways. The first is the Quran, which is like a dictation, divine dictation given to Muhammad. He didn't write it down immediately, but others remembered, and it was written down in bits and pieces and later sorted out in time. And there's also the life of Muhammad, the example of Muhammad, and that's called the Sunnah. So the word Sunnah refers to the teaching and the example of Muhammad as a totality, and both teaching and example. So basically what happened is that Muhammad's followers observed carefully what he taught and said, and they remembered it and eventually wrote it down, and that becomes a whole body of guidance in itself alongside the Quran. Now, it's quite important to understand that the Quran itself insists on the Sunnah. The Quran says you have to follow Muhammad. Actually, there are some Muslims today, reformers, who are Quran-only people, but the Quran itself makes that difficult. I've only given you a few verses here, but here are some. Surah is chapter in the Quran. Chapter 24:54 say, that is, Muhammad is asked by Allah to say, obey Allah and obey the messenger. If you obey him, the messenger, you will go aright. Or Surah 53, chapter 53, by the star when it sets, your comrade Muhammad doesn't err, nor is he deceived, nor does he speak out of his own desire. So Muhammad is not speaking out of his own will or character, he's speaking what God has given him. And that's not just the Quran, but everything that he did and said. Chapter 53, verse 7, and whatsoever the messenger gives you, take it, and whatsoever he forbids, abstain from it. So do what he tells you to do and refrain from what he forbids you from doing. Keep your duty to Allah. Allah is stern in reprisal. And there's quite a few verses that have very stern warnings about not following Muhammad's example. So here's the guidance that gives you the solution to ignorance. Now, how can I find out about the teaching and example of Muhammad? I've signed up on the dotted line, I've become a Muslim. Where do I find this information? This is obviously what Allah has given me for guidance. Well, this is recorded in a number of different formats. One is called hadith. These are individual sayings that record the teachings and example of Muhammad. They're usually in a format which report who passed the observation on, and then comes the statement or the act of Muhammad. And they're only recorded in a final form 200 years, more than 200 years after Muhammad. So the canonical sources of the hadith for the life of Muhammad are written down more than 2 centuries later. That would be like speaking about, codifying the official account of someone's life from the late 18th century today. It's interesting, actually, because the Gospels were written down within a lifetime, whereas surely people were recording things about Muhammad, but the actual finalised agreement on what he did and said only happened a couple of hundred years after that. So there's a big time gap. But anyway, there are hundreds of thousands of these traditions, but not all are regarded as equally reliable. And the canonical sources are regarded as well-sifted collections of material that are relied upon. And they're preserved in collections which are organised for legal purposes. The two most prestigious collections for Sunni Muslims, Islam's branched into these two major groups, Sunnis and Shiites. Sunnis the big group. The two collections that the Sunnis really respect most of all are the Sahih al-Bukhari. Bukhari is a man from Bukhara, and Sahih Muslim. Muslim is the name of this collector. They're the two collectors. And Sahih means reliable. So these are the two reliable collections. There are actually 6 that Sunni Muslims regard as canonical. So this is the Sahih al-Bukhari. You can see there's 9 volumes. This is English and Arabic side by side. And there are 4 volumes in the translation of the Sahih Muslim. And if you really want to be serious about Islam and understanding, you should get these books and read them. There's 13 volumes, and it's somewhat repetitive, but that you really get a sense of who Muhammad is in terms of Islam by reading those, because this is where you look to in Islam for the authority, for your religion. And they're organised for legal purposes. So, for example, the Sahih al-Bukhari, 9 physical volumes, but actually in the Arabic there's 93 books within that. For example, there's a book of oaths and vows, a book of tricks, book of marriage, book of manners, book of jihad. For example, the book of marriage would be composed of a list of things that Muhammad did and said that are related to marriage. Quite a long book that would be. The book of tricks would be all the things that Muhammad did and said about tricks. And jihad is about warfare, about taking slaves and killing enemies and winning in battle. Here's an example of a hadith. So this is the Sahih al-Bukhari, book 72, the Book of Good Manners. These are the materials I read after 9/11 because I said, I'm a researcher, I want to know what the sources say. I'm not going to spend 3 years reading secondary material. And so, for example, I encountered this in book 72, the Book of Good Manners, which has all the things that Muhammad did and said about being polite. Chapter 125 has the heading, What is liked regarding sneezing and what is disliked regarding yawning. And here's a hadith. It's somewhat abbreviated, but this is the person who reported the tradition. This is called a hadith, this whole thing. The Prophet said, so Muhammad said, Allah likes sneezing and dislikes yawning. So if someone sneezes and then praises Allah, then it's obligatory on every Muslim who hears him to say, may Allah be merciful to you. But as regards yawning, it's from Satan, so one must try one's best to stop it. If one says, ha, you know, if you go like that, excuse me, when yawning, Satan will laugh at him. So that's quite interesting. Muhammad's example is not just about very religious issues, it's about very daily matters as well, everyday issues. And in this case, you can imagine that in a Muslim society, a mother will train her child to cover their mouth as a matter of normal politeness. But that training is not just a cultural training, it's a religious training. Because in covering the mouth, the child is pleasing Allah according to the guidance that Muhammad has provided. And many, many practices that we might follow in a Christian society, we do out of just cultural tradition, and the cultures will vary from culture to culture. So Christianity is can be enculturated in very powerful ways with a lot of variation. Islam is very detailed in its requirements and tends to change culture in those ways, in the nitty-gritty of everyday observances, so that when a mother teaches a child in Islam to cover the mouth when yawning, they're training them in religion because of Muhammad's example. And one of the interesting things for me living in a Muslim society is I observed many practices that people followed, and at the time I thought a lot of those practices were just part of the culture. But later when I read all this material, I discovered again and again that things that I'd observed were actually based on faith. I don't think the people that I was speaking to and living with in the villages would have always been able to explain that to me. Like, I don't think every Muslim mother can recite that hadith off from memory. The culture gains a kind of momentum of its own, but over time the culture is shaped by faith. And some of the requirements of the things that you do are very particular and might seem even unusual to us. For example, Muhammad said you should put your right shoe on before your left shoe. And there are detailed descriptions about every aspect of life, going to the toilet, how you eat. And basically, you know, in Sunday school, the answer to most questions is Jesus. If you ever have a kid who's having a bit of trouble getting his questions right or her questions right, just say Jesus, and they'll be all right. The answer to a lot of questions in Islam is Muhammad. Let's see if you can get this right. Here we go. You might have observed that Muslim men, in fact the more radical ones, tend to wear big beards. Why do they wear big beards? The answer is? Exactly, because Muhammad had a big beard. In fact, he liked to dye his beard red, so often more radical Muslims will dye their beard red. One of my friends was a missionary in a Muslim country, and he naturally had a big red beard, so he was on a good start. I'd be okay too, but I don't have much of a beard, so a lot of things are based on Muhammad. It's amazing how true that is, actually. Now, another thing about these hadiths is that a lot of the basics of Islam are not in the Quran. For example, the 5 pillars of faith, which is to confess there's only one God and Muhammad is his prophet. That's the first one. The second is 5 times daily prayers. They're really ritual acts of observance, not just prayers as we understand them. And also paying zakat, alms, which are used for various religious purposes, including helping the poor. Pilgrimage to Mecca and fasting during Ramadan. These are the 5 pillars. They're not listed anywhere in the Quran. There are individual references to some of them, but if you were building a Quran-only Islam, you might not have those 5 pillars in it. They're there because on a certain day someone asked Muhammad, what is faith? And he said, this is faith. He gave the list. Similarly, if you get a little booklet from a mosque, they'll speak about 7 basic beliefs, such as belief in prophets, belief in angels, belief in predestination, and so on. Again, they are the 7 basic beliefs, not because Islamic theologians analysed Islam and came up with a list, but because on a certain day someone said to Muhammad, "Tell me about faith," and he said, "These are the 7 basic things." So, also the ritual for daily prayers, you will have seen Muslims bowing and doing various movements and washing themselves beforehand also. Everything in that comes from the hadiths, from Muhammad's teaching and example. There are some differences. Shiites and Sunnis have slight differences in how that's done, but they would have different evidence from their traditions about what Muhammad asked them to do. That's what it's based upon. So many aspects of Islam wouldn't be there if it weren't for Muhammad's example. Muslims wouldn't know how to pray 5 times a day. The pillars wouldn't be clear. The Quran is not designed to function on its own. Now, in addition to the hadiths, which are usually organised for legal purposes according to topics, you also have the biography, the sirah, and these are important because they're chronological. They put the life of Muhammad into a story, and the order in time of the things that Muhammad did and said is very important theologically, as we will see. The earliest of these biographies is by Ibn Ishaq, and it's published in English translation from the 50s as The Life of Muhammad by Guillaume. And he wrote this, Ibn Ishaq wrote this about 150 years or so after Muhammad. It was then, it's in a later edition from about 220 after Muhammad that we get the version that we have today. So again, quite a long time depth. The Gospels, as I said, are written down within a generation, but the most authoritative source for the life of Muhammad is only written 150 years later. So the difference would be, say, writing today about the Beatles versus writing today about events that took place in 1800 in America or 1850 or something, writing about the Civil War or something. So it's quite a time depth, really. Now, Muhammad. If Muhammad is the guide, as I've said, he's the source of everything, then you really want to know who's Muhammad. It's a big question, you know. And a few things about Muhammad. He experienced a lot of rejection. I hope to speak a bit more about this later. He was an orphan. He was given a hard time. A lot of his fellow tribespeople rejected his religious claims. Some aspects of Muhammad's life are positive. He cared for orphans. He cared about widows. He emphasised aspects of justice. But some of Muhammad's acts and deeds are in conflict with contemporary ethical standards. Some of the things he did and said are absolutely shocking and hair-raising and appalling. And you wouldn't be a free man in America if you did the things that Muhammad did. And one of the really, I confronted all this myself as I was reading through all this material, because it's all embedded in the hadiths, which form the guidance that you're meant to follow. So there's this problem: if the things that Muhammad did and said are absolutely shocking, but they are the best example and the thing that Muslims should follow, how is this to be resolved? And do I imply some other standard to my life other than Muhammad's example? If he's the best example, then by definition everything he did was good. How can I resolve those challenges? Interestingly, Islamic law forbids criticism of Muhammad. He himself was quite sensitive to criticism, and he had quite a number of people assassinated, but the people that were really killed the quickest were often the ones who made funny songs about him. When he went to Mecca, he spared all the Meccans when he conquered them, and although they'd opposed him quite bitterly, but the few people that he did put to death included a couple of, or commanded they should, a couple of slave girls who'd made funny songs about him. So Muhammad didn't like mockery at all. A Jewish woman in Medina also he had assassinated, an old man. They both had been mocking him. Now remember, he's the best example, so that becomes built into Sharia law or Islamic worldview, and so Islam doesn't like mockery of Muhammad either, because that's what Muhammad didn't like. And in fact, if you read Sharia manuals which contain detailed lists of all the requirements of Islam, they can sometimes have 1 or 2 pages long of ways in which you're forbidden to mock Muhammad or criticise him. You can't be sarcastic, you can't say this, you can't say that. Quite detailed descriptions of all the many things you're not supposed to do in criticising Muhammad. This makes Muhammad's life a very difficult subject to talk about, to think about. If you're going to tell someone about Muhammad's life, if you whitewash the story and leave out all the tough bits, it's a kind of deceptive, it's a kind of polemical, pro-positive presentation of Muhammad. On the other hand, if you include all that difficult stuff, people get traumatised, and you're offending Muslims because it's against Islamic law to make those things well known if you're doing it in any kind of critical way. So you're kind of caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. This man is a radicalising person. It forces you to make a decision one way or the other about how you're going to respond to his life and his material, and that's a big issue. The classical legal manuals are very detailed about that. Now, the organisation of the Quran, it's organised into chapters from the longest to the shortest, apart from the first. It's not in sequence, and the individual chapters are made up of many passages as well. It's not like the Bible that has a storyline to it, so it's very difficult to read it from beginning to end. It's very much Muhammad's personal document. I need to pick up the pace a bit. It's revealed progressively throughout his life, and many of the verses of the Quran relate to particular incidents that were happening in Muhammad's life at that time. Might be 2 or 3 verses together. And Muslims generally will say that Muhammad and the Quran can't be separated, because the context for interpreting the Quran is Muhammad's life and the things that were happening in his life at that time. But the Quran doesn't give you the context. You have to know that from your knowledge of Islam. So you can't interpret the Quran without knowing which passage in Muhammad's life or which episodes it relates to. I sometimes call the Quran the backbone of Islam, and Muhammad is the body. You can't have one without the other. The Hadiths also explain the Quran. Here's an example. This is a verse, chapter 60, verse 8, which says, Allah forbids you not, with regard to those who fought not against you because of religion and drove you not out of your homes, that you should show kindness and deal justly with them. Well, what does that mean? Well, as it happens, this was revealed to Muhammad when a woman asked him a question. Asma bint Abu Bakr said to Muhammad, my mother came to me hoping for my favour during the lifetime of the Prophet, or she's recounting this later. I asked the Prophet, may I treat her kindly? He said yes. And then someone reported that then Allah revealed this verse. So the first and obvious interpretation of this verse is that Muslims are allowed to be kind to their non-Muslim relatives if they haven't opposed their Islam and fought against them. So that's the basic meaning of that verse. But you find that explanation by finding the hadith that refers to that verse. You won't find that explanation by looking at the following or the preceding verse. That's not the context of that verse. The context of the verse is what happened in Muhammad's life at that point. Another thing that's important about the Quran is abrogation. Allah can substitute one revelation for another, sending a better one. Surah 2. Such of our revelations as we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring in place one better or the like thereof. Don't you know that Allah is able to do all things? So if there's a contradiction in the Quran, the later verse cancels the earlier verse. Basically, if you've got a boss, you do the last thing he said. The last job description is the valid one. But the sequence of the Quran, the time sequence, is necessary to understand this, but the Quran itself is not laid out in time sequence. So it gets us why you need to link the Quran to Muhammad's life. Here's an example. Ibn Kathir is a very well-known commentator from the 14th century who's widely used amongst Muslims in the world today. His commentary is on tafsir.com. The text is here somewhere. You can look it up for yourself. And one of the patterns of abrogation related to warfare. Earlier on, Muhammad was peaceful at God's command, and then later he was allowed to fight, and finally he was commanded to fight. And there were a series of abrogating verses that changed this story. So here's a commentary on chapter 209. And the commentator is explaining what 209 means. He says, and 209 says, forgive and overlook the unbelievers. So it's a command to be gracious to non-Muslims. But forgive and overlook was abrogated by the verse, kill the idolaters, 9:5, and fight the people of the book, 9:29. Allah's pardon for disbelievers was repealed. It was abrogated by the verse of the sword, 9:5. The messenger of Allah and his companions used to forgive the disbelievers and the people of the book, just as Allah commanded, until Allah allowed fighting them. Then Allah destroyed those who he decreed to be killed. So he's one of the great commentators. He's like a Calvin or a Luther or an Augustine. This is big guy, very widely used source, and there's an explanation from a commentary about how to interpret the Quran. Sometimes people say that people take the Quran out of context, so they take verses like violent verses out of context. I don't know if you've ever heard that about that, and people say you could take the Bible out of context too. But actually, if you put it in its context, what you'll find is that sometimes peaceful verses are abrogated by later verses. So if you put it properly in context, you'll find that the peaceful ones are the ones that need to be discounted. So the principles of interpretation are important, and the context is the life of Muhammad. So his life is important. What was he doing at that time? How did he treat unbelievers? So that's the context that you need to look at. So these are some of the challenges of understanding Islam. By the way, in your handouts I put a sheet, a bit cheeky of me perhaps, but I put a sheet of 12 bad beliefs, 12 false beliefs. These are 12 ideas that sabotage us in having an effective worldview to engage with Islam. And one of those beliefs is that if you put something in context, you'll always find it's better than you thought at first. In Islam, if you put things in context, sometimes they actually are worse than you thought. So be aware of that. Oh, you're taking that out of context. No, I'm putting it in context. So that's just some provocative food for thought. 12 bad ideas that make it hard for you to understand Islam. Now, there are some great tools available. You could buy the Tafsir ibn Kathir, the commentary, should be in the library for the seminary. It's also available online. So just to sum up, you have the Quran revealed word for word to Muhammad, and the Sunnah, the example of Muhammad, which is contained in Hadith, the traditions, and the Sirah, the biographies. Now, I want to make a few polemical comments. Muslims have a right to study Islam for themselves. Sometimes we're told, oh, you can't do this. I once said to a Muslim, a guy who'd become a Muslim, and I said, I've read all the hadiths, you know. He said, oh, you're not supposed to read them. I found it very interesting. I learnt a lot. But you really do have a right to study it for yourself. I'd say more than that, you have a responsibility to do that. Why? Well, there's lots of things I could say, but one is that Islam defines itself in contrast to Christianity and Judaism. From its very core, it contains a reference to your faith. For example, chapter 1 of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, means the opening, is recited 17 times a day within the 5 times daily prayers. So it's a repeated chapter every Muslim should know this off by heart. And it says in Arabic, show us the straight path, the guidance, the path of those whom thou hast favoured, not the path of those who earn thy anger nor those who go astray. And Muhammad explains in a hadith that those who have earned the anger are the Jews and those who are led astray are the Christians. So that's the normative explanation of that part of the prayer. So just to make it really clear, every Muslim who prays 5 times a day, 17 times a day, prays not to be like a misguided Christian. And 17 times a day prays not to be a Jew under the wrath of God. They might not know that's what they're praying, it's in Arabic, but that is the kind of received explanation of that prayer. So that's a bit of a challenge. And my view is that if someone's praying that they not be me that often, I have a right to know what their religion says. It's this kind of human right to understand someone else's beliefs for myself. And so if he says to me, oh, well, I don't think that's what it means, I'd say, well, that's very interesting. I wonder what Muhammad said about it. And what did the scholars say? Is that a common view? Do other people feel the same? And so that you need to ask searching questions. There's also a few political issues. The Quran says that Muslims are the best people with a destiny to guide mankind. You're the best community that's been raised up for mankind. You command right conduct and forbid indecency, and you believe in Allah. There's a T-shirt from a protester in Los Angeles, and I'll draw your attention down to the bottom. For I command what is right and forbid what is wrong. So this is an idea that Muslims have a divine destiny to instruct, to guide. That is, they're guided by Allah, but they have a responsibility to guide the world. And anyone who thinks they have a responsibility to command me what's right and wrong, I have a right to understand their beliefs for myself. I think that's natural. And also, the Quran also says that it's the destiny of Islam to rule over all other religions. Here's a protester in New York. He's got a picture of the White House, Islam will dominate, and the black flag of Islam flying from it. He it is who sent his messenger with the guidance and the religion of truth that he may cause it to triumph over all religion. Now, the classical interpretation of that is it's a command for political dominance. And it seems to me, again, that if the faith is actually teaching some Muslims, and some Muslims take it that way, for example, this protester, that I have a right to understand that ideology for myself, because this is not just a faith that's practiced by Muslims for Muslims, it's a faith that makes claims over my life. And I have a right to have a critical, independent view about it in a spirit of freedom and open inquiry. Let me keep going. The Sharia means the way, and it's a word that's been developed in Islam for the totality of the path that you walk when you're following the right guidance, and that's why it's called the path, the way. It's the way to submit. It's a system of rules for all of life, very detailed. It really requires an Islamicized society to follow properly. So the Islamic way that is followed in Muhammad's example really presupposes and assumes you're living in an Islamic political order. And that is one of the great theological challenges facing Muslims in the West today, that they're not in an Islamicized order, and they disagree amongst themselves about what to do about that. Some Muslims say it's their duty to make sure the country they live in does become an Islamic state. Others say, no, I can follow my religion without making my country an Islamic state. But Muslims don't agree on that, and there's an active dispute really going on within the Muslims about that view. Another way of putting it is there's a view that Muslims will never have religious freedom until the state is for Allah and the country is a Sharia state. But the definition of religious freedom in Islam is living in a society where you can practice your religion without any restriction or impediment, and that's only possible when Islam is the rule of the land. So sometimes people say to me, Islam's not a religion, it's a political system. I don't say that, but what I'd say is that Islam doesn't distinguish between religion and politics, and the political expectation is part of the faith as well. So that's a very different way of understanding religion from what we're used to. Interestingly, medieval Muslim philosophers criticised Christian Europe for separating religion and politics. They were very aware of this aspect of the Christian tradition, that there was a separation, and they thought it was a weakness. So it's a very long-standingly, people understand this is a big distinction. Now, there's a manual if you want to read about Sharia law, Get the Reliance of the Traveller. It's a great summary of a particular school. Here's an example of Sharia. Abu Hurairah reported Muhammad saying that the rider should greet the pedestrian, and the pedestrian, the one who's seated in a small group, should greet a large group. So if you're riding a horse and you see someone walking along that you know, you should greet them and then they greet you. When I was in Aceh, it was on the motorbike. So if you're on a motorbike and you see someone walking, then the person on the motorbike says hello first. It's just politeness. And we have these rules, who introduces who, and does the man introduce the woman, and all these sort of rules of politeness. They vary from culture to culture, but in Islam, it's worked out for horses and by extension, motorbikes. So that's an everyday thing. But let me take you to a rather more serious matter. Time magazine in June in 2002 said that an Islamic court in Nigeria has ordered that Amina Lawal, who bore a child more than 9 months after her divorce, not be executed by stoning until 2003, when her baby is weaned. This was a big issue in 2002. Why is Amina Lawal being sentenced to death? And this was the ruling. Now, I think you'd be able to answer if I ask you, why did the judges in northern Nigeria come to this decision? What's the answer? Exactly. So where would you look to find these principles? You'd look in the hadiths. You could look it up on the internet yourself. So here's the tradition. There's several, but here is one. There came to Muhammad a woman from Ghamid and said, Allah's messenger, I've committed adultery, so purify me. And the Holy Prophet turned her away. On the following day, she said, Allah's messenger, why did you turn me away? By Allah, have become pregnant. He said, well, if you insist upon it, then go away till you give birth. Actually, she's asking for atonement. She wants to be cleansed of her sin. When she was delivered, she came with the child wrapped in a rag and said, here's the child who I've given birth to. He says, go away and suckle him until you wean him. When she'd weaned him, she came to him with the child, holding a piece of bread. She said, Allah's apostle, here he is, I've weaned him, and he eats food. And Muhammad entrusted the child to one of the Muslims and then pronounced punishment, and she was put in a ditch up to her chest, and he commanded people, and they stoned her. Now, as someone who'd read these hadiths after 9/11, I was fascinated by the media commentary around this event. Because some said, oh, this is a medieval abuse of Islam, and it's not the true treatment of Islam. Other people, there are lots of different views, but the reality is what Nigeria did was, in the northern states are majority Muslims, so they decided as a concession to establish Sharia law as part of the legal system of the northern states in Nigeria. And I don't think everyone fully understood what that meant, but when the Sharia courts were set up, they began to rule on such matters as adultery, and in the course of time, Amina Lawal came before one of these courts, and the judges, who were well trained, looked up the example of Muhammad and they found out what the rulings were and they applied it. And so you end up with a situation where a very big international human rights movement was fought to try and rescue this woman from the consequence. Notice also the waiting until the child is weaned is fully based on the example of Muhammad as well. It's quite a scrupulous ruling based on the teaching of Islam. So that's why I say Muhammad's example is quite confronting, and it's not just a matter of that's the way he lived, that's interesting, but in fact it becomes the foundation of Islam as well. So when you get formal Islam being introduced, like Sharia courts, then you'll find Muhammad's example begins to rule the proceedings of those processes. Now, the Gospels and the life of Christ are public truth. You can get them, you read them in an afternoon. But the primary sources on Muhammad have, until quite recently, been hard to access. And classical Arabic is difficult. Even Arabic speakers have trouble with it. Often common understandings are sanitised. If you read Karen Armstrong's Life of Muhammad, it's a very censored story. She won't explain lots of things. It's interesting to ask why people do that. But, for example, Muhammad picked up a few concubines. He killed certain men and took their women as his wives. This is not always explained, and accurate information can be kind of confrontational. So information until recently has not really been democratised, but in recent times the information is becoming much better known. So that's creating a bit of a challenge or a crisis in the Muslim world. There's also a problem, I'm going to go over about 5 minutes to do this, but there's a problem of not always completely accurate translations. For example, there's a verse that says a husband can beat his wife. And I don't raise this to be unkind about Islam. This is a serious issue for many women in the Muslim world today. Muslim women's groups in Australia have expressed concern about domestic violence in Muslim communities in Australia, and it's a problem in other areas as well. Now, some translations translate it as chastise, which is a bit misleading, because in English that could mean a verbal rebuke, but the Arabic just means to strike. So you've got this problem of what is the translation we're working with, what the Arabic actually says. Now I'm going to just introduce you to one subject which is quite a difficult subject, which is that of lawful deception, just to illustrate the challenge of this material. There's a verse in the Quran that says, "Let not the believers take for friends or helpers unbelievers rather than believers." That is, don't be friends with non-Muslims. If you do that, Allah won't help you, unless it's by way of precaution, that you may guard yourselves against them. So what this is saying is that when Muslims are needing the help or protection of non-Muslims, they're allowed to make friends with them as a precautionary measure. Now, when you see a verse like that in the Quran, you can't just interpret it for yourself. You need to put it in context. And part of the context, apart from the life, is the tradition of interpretation of the scholars down the centuries. So let's have a look at some of the commentaries. This is Ibn Kathir. I mentioned him before. You can check this for yourself. I haven't just made this up. It's on the internet. Believers are not allowed to show friendship to disbelievers outwardly, are allowed to show friendship to disbelievers outwardly, but never inwardly. Abu Darda said, "We smile in the face of some people, though our hearts curse them." Al-Hassan said, the taqiyya, deception, the guarding, is allowed until the day of resurrection. Or Al-Zamakhshari, another great commentator, the heart is comforted by enmity and hatefulness. So you're making friends with your non-Muslim people around you when you're not a dominant position, but your heart feels happy because you hate them in your heart. Now, this is really difficult material. I don't know, how would you respond if you were reading this for yourself in the quiet of your room and no one had ever told you this, and you opened a commentary and that's what it was saying? I mean, how would you respond to that? And actually, there's a number of instances in Muhammad's life where he did practice not telling the truth. And if you look up a Sharia manual of Islamic law, you'll find a list of the circumstances where it's permissible or obligatory to lie. And I must say that telling a lie in Islam is an awful sin. It's totally forbidden. But there are certain exceptions. Just as we tolerate the fact that we have spies who work for us, who might be a bit deceptive in their activities. I think that sort of generally people accept that about intelligence agencies. But in Islam, the exceptions are somewhat broader. For example, Muhammad, husbands can deceive their wives in order to maintain marital harmony, and Muhammad is the answer for that too. But here's a philosopher, great philosopher, Al-Ghazali, who tried to systematise Islam's understanding of truth-telling. He said lying is sometimes permissible for a given interest, scholars having established criteria defining what types of it are lawful. Speaking is a means to obtain objectives. If a praiseworthy aim is attainable through both telling the truth and lying, it's unlawful to accomplish it through lying because there's no need for it. When it's possible to achieve such an aim by lying but not by telling the truth, it's permissible to lie if attaining the goal is permissible, and obligatory to lie if the goal is obligatory. He was a great man, one of the great thinkers. There's a lecture that was given in Australia. It was on the internet for a while. Zachariah Matthews was described in the Australian magazine, in the Australian newspaper, as a leading moderate. And in this lecture in 2001, he said, he gave out a number of steps to establish Islam, and one of them was deception is necessary and secrets should be hidden. Followers should be informed on a need-to-know basis. So he's teaching young Muslims how they should establish Islam in the world. And he gave a number of examples from the life of Muhammad to explain to these young believers why it was necessary to build Islam wherever they were based on these principles. He later, in fairness to him, gave a lecture. He was criticised by this on public radio in Sydney. And he later gave a lecture where he said, he emphasised how evil it was to lie and people shouldn't lie. So there's this tension between the two different ideas, really.
Let me get right to it here. Are you...
Before we do this, this is a... This will take a minute or two. This man, Tamimi, is being interviewed on radio in some sound bites, and on the other, he's street preaching to a group of young Muslims. And you'll hear the same person speaking in very different modalities to different audiences. So just listen to it.
Let me get right to it here. Are you suggesting that British policies were the motivation for the people who were arrested last week on charges of plotting to blow up airliners?
First of all, we are not sure that this plot is real. It happened so many times before that the intelligence services here spoke about plots and turned to be total hoax. However, we do accept that there is a threat to this country, and that is the product of its foreign policy. Britain was never targeted before by Muslim groups. It never had this problem before. This problem started when our troops joined American troops in invading Iraq and causing a mess throughout the region.
Well, if what you say is true, should Britain be intimidated into changing its foreign policy then?
It's not a question of Britain being intimidated.
Those who resist, those who fight, those who put up a jihad are the true representatives of the Palestinians and of the Muslims.
You see, if there is a problem somewhere, we have to go to the roots of the problem in order to be able to solve it.
In order to eradicate this cancer from the body of humanity.
The government of Tony Blair kept insisting that this was an ideological problem. We don't accept this.
You know why Tony Blair, George Bush, and all the members of this camp are so worried? They are worried because they know the world can see clearly today that Israel is a menace, is a threat to humanity.
People don't do this because of ideology, although ideology may be resorted to as a pretext or as a source of legitimizing the act. Because there is a political crisis, people are driven to desperation, and elements, whether within the community here or elsewhere, might be tempted to use force in order to avenge the killing of what they believe to be their brothers and sisters elsewhere in the world.
As they withdrew from South Lebanon because of the great jihad of Hezbollah.
Do you think that there is significant support in the British Muslim community for using violence to express opposition to British policies?
Not at all. The majority of Muslims are absolutely opposed to the use of violence.
And as they withdrew from Gaza because of the great jihad of Hamas and Islamic Jihad.
It's illegitimate, it's not acceptable. But no Muslim individual or Muslim group has total authority over the minds and the hearts of every single individual in a community like this. We have a responsibility to explain this to our youngsters, that they cannot resort to force.
And we say we are willing to bring it to an end peacefully. But if they
think that's enough, but this is quite a challenge, really, that people can have two very different ways of relating to the world, depending on their context. In one context, he says, we have a responsibility to teach our children not to use violence, and the other says we have every right to use violence. That's the other language. So what I want to point out about this particular sort of pattern, I could give you many other examples of this, is that it's not necessarily immoral from an Islamic perspective. That is, if he has a set of beliefs in place that allow him, under certain circumstances, to give misleading impressions, which is preferable really to straight deception, then he might be acting as a religious person within a certain religious set of religious norms. So this sort of pattern of behaviour might not be regarded within his own community as a sign that he's a dodgy or shady person. Quite the contrary, he might in fact be well formed by his faith. The other thing I want to make a point in sort of listening to that somewhat inflammatory juxtaposition of two texts is that not all Muslims adopt this way of relating to non-believers, and Muslims vary a great deal. I've spoken to Muslims that categorically reject this sort of use of misleading interactions, but it's very clear in the sources that it is there, and the Sharia manuals, the official textbooks make it clear. And there's many examples of significant leading Muslims using these sorts of strategies. And it's a challenge if you go to the mosque and you meet your local imam and he seems such a decent guy, and you make friends with him, you talk about many issues. How do you actually know? I don't mean to cast doubts in basic conversations with people, but how do you really know his worldview? Does he know your worldview a lot better than you know his? And if you were just listening to Tamimi just on the basis of that interview on National Public Radio, what impression would you have of him as a person? So this does create a lot of problems, I think, in understanding Islam. Let me just wrap up here. Another example of somewhat misleading information that sometimes people claim there's no variation in the Quran, there's just one Quran and it's the same all over the world. In fact, there are many different versions of the Quran, so it's actually quite hard to find out true information. I've heard people swear black and blue that female circumcision is not part of Islam religion. It is. It's very clear. There are hadiths that refer to it. There's a whole school of Islam in which it's compulsory. So that you'll get people so confident that they know the truth, and it causes a lot of confusion to try and actually work it out. So I've worked really hard. Everything that I'm saying to you today, I've tried to be really confident. I've checked and be careful with. But I'm just raising with you a problem of knowledge. How can you know what is Islam and how to follow it? And I think a lot of people will vote for Sharia courts or Sharia law to be introduced in a country because they're Muslims, but they only discover what it means later. My friend Daniel, I'm so sorry he wasn't able to come, but he was one of the young revolutionary guards who wanted, Ayatollah Khomeini in the Islamic Revolution. They were bitterly disappointed when they discovered what radical Islam was going to be like, and many disillusioned people in Iran today. Jihad, another example, I'll leave that to you to check. A lot of things are said about jihad just being a personal struggle, but that's not at all what classical Orthodox Islam teaches. Now, religions are not all the same. Some people, maybe you don't believe this, but many people do believe that religions are basically all the same. But Islam is a program of following Muhammad's example, and it makes a difference who you follow. If you follow Christ, you'll take up your cross and follow his example. If you follow Muhammad, you'll follow his example, and he lived a very different life. So it makes a difference who you follow. Christians don't try and copy Jesus' customs of the first century. We don't even know most of them. We don't know about how he ate and how he went to the toilet, but Muslims are bound into the details of Muhammad's life, and so strictly following that can lead you into a kind of 7th century existence. So the key question is really, who will you follow? Will you follow Christ or follow Muhammad? That's a big question for Europe and for America, for Australia, for many countries, for the Middle East. By the way, I'll just finish here, and there's a few minutes left for questions. I went a bit long because I gave a bit of a longer introduction at the beginning. We took a bit of a while to get going. There's a friend of mine in Tasmania called Samuel Green. This is not on your handouts, but he's done a great set of DVD sessions called Engaging with Islam, and he's produced group discussion questions, and you can actually download this from the internet and use it for a small group if you wish. He's very clear and fair, I think. And he's oriented towards sharing your faith as well. So that's www.engaging/with-islam.info. Or if you just Google Engaging with Islam and Samuel Green, you'll find it as well. So I commend that to you. I wonder if we can take a few minutes for questions. I'm sorry I've taken a little bit longer than I thought. Could you help me? Thank you, Catherine.
Right, and our plan was to, after each session, offer the other speakers the chance to ask the first question or make the first comment, and then we'll go to the audience and we'll be sure to gather up your questions, if not now, during the next session.
Thanks very much, Mark, for a very compelling unfolding of Islam, based greatly in your own experience in Aceh and upon your extensive research, and that's important for us to know. I'm responding, and you'll hear more about this in the next hour, so I won't take a lot of time, but I'm responding as a kind of China hand, as well as a Christian, and what strikes me about Islam, and always has, is the approach to living that is characteristic of ancient empire, where persons are told what to do. And every job as in China, people are told what to do, and you follow your job description, and you're not to vary from what you're told to do. You have a task, you perform it. And so I'm wondering, in the Jewish tradition, there's a great, following the Ten Commandments, which are largely about what not to do, although there are a few in there that tell us what to do. And then that's followed by a lot of legal requirements as the law of God. What is the difference then, perhaps, between Islam and Judaism in that sense of being told what to do? And then I'd like to go on and even consider how does that compare with Christian witness, in which all of the law has been, as it were, collapsed by Jesus into two commandments: love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and spirit, and love your neighbor as yourself. So that in many ways we are given a tremendous freedom about what to do if we keep those two commandments, whereas in these kind of empirical empire forms, we've given very little freedom.
Yes.
We have to do just what we're told.
Very good reflections. Sometimes when people leave Islam and become Christians, they can feel quite lost because they want to know the Christian way of doing everything. And basically their whole life has been structured by Islamic practice. And in leaving Islam, should they still put their right foot in front of their left foot when they enter a house? And they want to know which foot to use, you know. And so that's a challenge in discipling people and encouraging them to be free and to think in a free way. Judaism does have a lot of detailed rules. I live in the heart of Jewish Melbourne and very aware of this with my neighbours. There is a difference. In Islam, there's a prohibition on questioning the authority of Muhammad and the system of law. It's fixed. The fixedness is not just what you should do, but how you should think and question. Whereas there's very much a tradition in the Bible and in Jewish practice of questioning and wrestling with God. And there's a strong tradition in rabbinical Judaism of argument. And in fact, even Muhammad found that he called the Jews the men who argued a lot. So there's an intellectual freedom, and I think you do see the difference. There's a number of people that I've met who've left a more radical or conservative form of Islam say the biggest change for them was to realise they could ask a question. That was a huge change. So that's a shift.
We have lots of questions, and I've tried to note who had their hand up first. And I see 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'm going to start over here.
Thank you for your instructive comments. In the beginning, you said that if there are contradictions in the Quran, the later passage would then cancel the earlier one. Yet later on, you mentioned the perfection of the Quran, that within the Quran there is complete perfection.
Yes.
Do those two comments, do they actually contradict each other?
Yes, well, you could use that as an argument against Islam, and some Christians do, the contradictions in the Quran. But from a strict Islamic point of view, there's no contradiction, because Allah has explained in the Quran that the later verses do cancel the earlier ones. But this is a characteristic contrast between Christian and Muslim way of thinking. And Islam teaches, for example, that the Bible was corrupted, and Christian response is, well, how could God let his word be corrupted? So, and we have a very different approach. I mean, I'll speak about that later today, but that's very much in the area. It's a typical interfaith apologetic debate between a Christian understanding. From the Islamic point of view, there's no contradiction. That's just Allah has done this and he's done that, and he's Allah and he can do what he likes. It's not a problem. He can't contradict himself. By definition, whatever he says is right. So it's just not even allowed to ask that question.
In light of your study and what you've said, to kind of piggyback on that question, there's very popular to say moderate Muslim, but it seems like according to your study and what you've learned that there is a right way to follow Islam. If you follow by the book, it's very clear from Muhammad's life. So would you say that though there is a lot of people that call themselves moderate Muslims, would you say that there is in reality a such thing as moderate Islam or not?
I have two things to say about that. Firstly, there are many ex-Muslims who say there's no such thing as moderate Islam. For example, Ibn Waraq said that there can be moderate Muslims, but there's no such thing as moderate Islam. So that's the first thing. The second comment is a comment about cultural, intellectual practice and thought. The idea of extreme and moderation is part of the Western discourse. But in the Arab world and the Islamic context, that whole concept isn't applicable. Like Muslims, when you're living in a Muslim country, you don't think of moderate Islam and extreme Islam. It's just Islam, and you follow it or you don't. It's one of the fallacies that I address in my list of 12 ideas, that if you're sort of in the middle, you're all right, but if you're on the edge, you fall off the edge of the world and you're extreme, you know. And people will say that. There was a guy called Hoffa who wrote a book in the 40s called True Believers, which he said the real problem in the world is extremism. So if you get an extreme fascist, he could just as well be an extreme communist. It's not what you believe, but it's whether you're extreme that's the problem. This has become part of our discourse in Western society, but most people in the world don't think like that. And it's not the way Islam works. And it's quite actually, I sometimes say it like this, suppose you went to your doctor, you said, look, I'd like a moderate surgeon, please. I don't want an extreme one who follows all the rules to the letter. I'd like one that's sort of pretty relaxed about his job, you know. And look, if you're following the laws of Allah, you know, you're going to, you want to be fairly strict. But there is something else. There are disagreements among Muslims about which laws to follow and how to follow them. And Muslims are sometimes more religious observant or not. I don't know that it's right to call non-observant Muslims moderate Muslims, which implies they have a kind of different Islam. It's not that they have a different Islam, it's just that they're less rigorous in their practice, or they're not so tied to certain principles. So it's a peculiar Western kind of rhetoric, this idea of extremism, and I think it's fundamentally unhelpful when understanding Islam. It's like Wittgenstein, you're drawing the frame of your own worldview and imposing it on a system that doesn't recognise that distinction at all.
In my last assignment in the military, I worked at the State Department for the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. And one of my responsibilities was to manage the Islamic Roundtable for him. And I was in the State Department on 9/11, and after that, no one really understood what Muslim was about. And so they all had their Muslim of the day in order to find out. And one of the fascinating things was the difficulty in trying to make public policy and foreign policy when you really don't understand the faith of the people that are sitting with you.
Yes.
I brought some Muslims to Charlotte Beers, who was the Undersecretary for Diplomacy, and she was asking questions right off of Madison Avenue. And finally I asked her, you know, why don't you let them phrase some question that they wish you would answer?
Yes.
And that was the only way we began to have a kind of fair dialogue. But, you know, what kind of advice do you give to policymakers on how to handle Muslims?
Well, you know, we need the courage to actually engage with Islam as it actually is, and many people who have left Islam say that's what the West most of all needs, is to understand Islam and acknowledge what it is. It's very difficult because we're frightened of being bigots, we're frightened of discriminating against people. We really want to believe everyone's good and decent. There's lots of challenges we face in doing that. At the moment, America's in a bad place. John Brennan, who's a terrorism advisor, denies the classical understanding of jihad as a matter of policy. It's very hard to fight an enemy who's ideologically driven when you deny that his ideology exists. The Dutch had that problem. That's why they lost the war for 30 years against the Chinese. They did not understand the ideology. So in many ways, things have got worse in recent years in the US. And at the top levels of the military, as a matter of policy, there's a refusal to acknowledge the ideology of jihad. It's costly in the blood of people, really, that we're fighting a war blindfold. So I just think that's very sad. And the problem is that some of those guys, the insurgents, they understand us very, very well. They know us back to front. They understand how we think, but we are very reluctant to change our worldview to allow our minds to think differently. And you'll see this happening again and again. That's why I did those little 12 points. If you strongly adhere to any of these 12 points, just have a little think about whether they're the best ideas, because each of these will sabotage you in understanding Islam.
We're going to take one more question, and then we'll have our break, and I guarantee you we'll have time for more questions in the next session.
Sir, I have one question and two comments. Should I ask the question first and comments first, or whatever? Okay, I'll make the comment and then ask the question.
Quick comments.
Right, oh, sir. Sir, as far as the Quran is concerned, according to Islamic theology, what Christ is to Christians, the Quran is to Muslims. Like John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. For Muslims, the Quran is similar, but it says Quran was with God. It is something like that. You just cannot be contradicted, it cannot be opposed. As it is, it has supposedly come from Allah to...
It's regarded as absolutely
exactly.
Perfect. Yes.
It is the Spirit of God in the form of a book.
Yes.
Jesus, it is God made man who's come to us, and for Muslims, the Quran is the Spirit of God which has come in the
Bless
form.
you, brother. Next comment.
Yes, sir. And the other thing is, sir, regarding this... the verses, tolerant and intolerant verses, in Mecca, all the verses which have been revealed in Mecca are very tolerant. They display a lot of patience. But the verses which have been revealed in Medina, they are the ones which start preaching intolerance, and where the sword verses were revealed,
yes,
which preach killing and kill the infidels where you see them. That is the...
Question.
I have two more comments, but I'll keep them to myself. Now is the question.
Tell me
what is the concept of salvation in Islam, the way we understand it?
I just want to say, Mecca, Muhammad, I'll speak a bit more about this later hopefully, but Mecca was the earlier part of Muhammad's prophetic career, and he was in a minority position and weak. And some Muslim theologians have explained that Allah in his kindness taught Muhammad to be peaceful then, because he was in a vulnerable position. But when he gained political power, then that peaceful behaviour was abrogated. And I gave you one of the verses explaining that pattern. It was a series of steps. So people say there's a big distinction between Mecca and Medina. In fact, in Mecca, Muhammad was killing his enemies in hell. I mean, a lot of the verses in Mecca are about how they're going to pay in the end. So it wasn't completely a peaceful time, but there was a big political shift. And Islam grounds the beginning of Islam to the going to Mecca. That is, it's the establishment of political Islam that's regarded as year zero in Islam. Now, the question was salvation. I think that in fact there is no concept of salvation in the way we understand it, that the equivalent of salvation is success in this life and the next. And in my book I have a very nice quote from a Muslim author that explains that is really the equivalent. As for getting into paradise, that's a result of God passing judgment on you. Allah makes a decision based on your sins, and perhaps he's merciful or not, perhaps you've done good. If you've died in holy war, then you have a guaranteed ticket into paradise, but otherwise there are lots of different things in the Quran and the life of Muhammad that give people tips about whether they'll make it or not. Muhammad said, I do not know what will happen to me. And that can be quite a powerful issue to raise with Muslims. If Muhammad didn't know what was going to happen to him, then why would that be? And there is no assurance of salvation unless you give your life fighting. So that is a difference. But yeah, I don't use terms like salvation speaking about Islam. That's just like Wittgenstein's drawing the frame all the time. You really need to avoid using terms inappropriately when speaking about something that's structured very differently. I'm going to stop there.
Okay, well, thank you. And we're going to take a break now, and we will begin right again at 10:30, and we will hear from Professor Diane Obenchain. So please ensure